It is a great honor to welcome to the show once again Professor Robert Kaufman of Pepperdine University. Um, we are here today to discuss his book, which he wrote in 2007, titled In Defense of the Bush Doctrine in light of the Iraq War 20 years later. How are you today, Robert? Thank you for
I'm
joining.
well, thank you. How are you?
I'm doing all right. Thank you.
Right.
So my first question is, the invasion of Iraq by the United States Armed Forces was in 2003. Now we're here in 2023, 20 years later. What would be your appraisal of that particular operation?
A, it remains controversial. B, we snatched defeat from the jaws of victory. And C, however suboptimal the outcome is at the moment because of our premature withdrawal under Obama, Iraq at least is less bad. I won't put it in terms of better, but it's a less odious tyranny with more potential for upside than it was in 2003 under the vice grip of Saddam Hussein. And also, it's almost inevitable if you read the Kay and Dilfer Commission report that Saddam would have had nuclear weapons by now. So bad as the Middle East is, with Iran on the cusp of a breakout and other countries on the verge of initiating their own major programs, things would have been even worse by my count if Saddam had remained in power. It's too bad we didn't stay the course, because the positives, had we done so, would have outweighed the negatives much more substantially.
Mhm. Of course, we cannot mention the war in Iraq without mentioning September 11, 2001. So do you remember where you were and what you did during that fateful day?
Yeah, I remember vividly. I was at the University of Vermont, and one of my colleagues crossed the aisle to my office and said, "Have you heard what's happening?" Also, it had a added vicarious meaning for me because I was in my pre-PhD days, a corporate lawyer briefly. I worked on the 58th floor of the World Trade Center. I also have 4 Columbia degrees, so I knew exactly where it was and actually knew people in the building. Luckily, in the law firm I worked for, only one person lost her life tragically, and that was quite fortunate. But yes, I remember that very powerfully, the exact moment, and thinking vicariously. I took a pay cut to go into academics, but today that looks pretty good by comparison. And I remained in the World Trade Center.
Mhm. So we're talking about the Bush Doctrine, which refers to the foreign policy, I guess, agenda of Bush 43, George W. Bush. But as I read it correctly, the foreign policy platform in which Bush was elected by is summarized in in that phrase, a humble foreign policy. What changed after September the 11th?
Well, after September 11th, we learned again what we've learned before, that to quote the great group, the Supremes, especially in this technological environment, you can run, but you can't hide. That applies at this moment as well for those who think that there are easy ways out of defending freedom in Ukraine, Taiwan, and elsewhere. And what 9/11 brought home is, whether we like it or not, there are entities in the world, multiple at this moment, that hate us, not necessarily for what we've done, but for who we are. Let me add also that my contention in the book was the two major components of the Bush doctrine, regime change as a war aim to address the root cause of the conflict. That's not new. That is a goal that's had a long tradition in American foreign policy, going all the way back to World War II. And then the idea that there are some times when you have to use force sooner rather than later, and that you can't make it categorically a last resort. That goes all the way back to St. Thomas Aquinas's formulation of just war theory, which I think is superior to the modern alternatives, where Aquinas wisely left silent the issue of when you use force. That's a judgment based on prudence. And moving up to the 20th century, in my book and since, I've noted several major instances where using force sooner sometimes makes much strategic and moral sense. To paraphrase Winston Churchill, you save much blood, toil, tears, and sweat doing it sooner against certain categories of threats than waiting until later. The emblematic example of that is the 1930s, when people wanted to make the use of force a last resort against Hitler. It was the equivalent of wishful thinking to treat cancer. And in that particular case, and several others I've written about, it would have been much better to take it out early rather than late, because waiting exponentially compounded the cost. That doesn't mean that using force as a first resort is your automatic response. It means that statesmen, in the repertoire of their options, have to weigh when to use force based on the gravity of the threat, the availability of plausible alternatives, the nature of the regime, the risk calculus of your enemy. It's not something that you can say, as modern just war theorists say, categorically it should be a last resort. And of course, then there's the definitional problem. When you say, if you're in this philosophical camp, force should be a last resort, our response is, okay. How do you know when you've reached the last resort? Or are you hostage to literally anybody who says, we haven't tried this, or we haven't tried that? So it seems to me, rather than treating these standards, which are useful, as mechanical rules, they raise questions that a reasonable person should ask. You don't want to use force, so there are available alternatives. Maybe you want to wait, but is waiting costly? These are the things that a prudential statesman weighs in determining when, how, and for what purpose to use force. And when I decided to write the book, I was walking around in a Barnes and Noble here in California, and I noticed all these books. Bush is this, Bush is that, Bush is a XYZ. And I didn't have the same reaction. I thought it was ahistorical and profoundly wrong to criticize what he did as a categorical imperative. And so I decided to write the book. It actually sort of had a happy ending for me, because last week, President Bush came to speak at Pepperdine University's law school anniversary dinner. And I was honored that President Bush 43 liked my book so much. I was one of the few people defending him robustly at the time. They invited me to have a private meeting with him for 15 minutes, where he exhibited his customary good humor and was extremely complimentary. So that, in a nutshell, gives you my pedigree of why I wrote the book I did when I did it.
I believe even the most charitable of liberals often foment and maintain this narrative that Bush was kind of a buffoon, and it was his surrounding circles, including Dick Cheney and Richard Pearl and Paul Wolfowitz, who were actually running the show. So, is that I guess accurate?
One, I know all these people. I know Paul, and he's a very honorable man. And I knew Richard from my book on Scoop Jackson. In the first place, Richard Pearl wasn't even in the administration. In the second place, the left's treatment of American presidents who they disagree with as a buffoon has a long history. In the early 60s, the liberal complaint about Eisenhower was he was a dunce. Well, when we looked at Eisenhower's actual record, we found out what a lot of us suspected at the time, that Eisenhower was very sophisticated and the leader of his administration. He wasn't John Foster Dulles' Secretary of State's lackey. He was actually the driving force. The same goes for Reagan. The phrase used about Reagan prior to my colleague Kyron Skinner here demolishing that, publishing, editing his letters, Reagan is his own hands. Chalmers Johnson of the Washington Post derisively called Reagan an amiable dunce. So Bush 41 is his father, the 41st president of the United States. Bush was the 43rd, is in a long list of Republican presidents who progressives assume can't walk and chew gum at the same time, so they must be led. There's no evidence whatsoever for that. And having conversed with Bush, knowing his people and knowing the people you mentioned, Bush was the leader of his administration. He was not the captive of a nefarious, meretricious cabal. So that fits into the progressive pantheon that Republican presidents are too stupid and ignorant to act on their own. That's not so at all historically. And in Bush's case, if you look at the record, and I can say from hearing him, reading what he's written, and having the honor of speaking with him directly and knowing some of his people, I had previously got into the White House when the book was published and talked for a long time with Karl Rove about it at Rove's invitation. The popular perception of Bush being intellectually deficient is wrong. He was a great reader. His wife, Laura, was a librarian, and the impression of Bush as being uninformed is a prejudice of the progressives. I'll be blunt that people fell for Obama's surface polish. That's the subject of my fourth book, if you have me back. But in almost every way, Bush 43 was much better informed on international issues and had much broader and deeper experience coming to the presidency than Obama. And it showed, although Obama's terrible foreign policy record also emanated not just from a lack of experience, but from his underlying assumptions about the world in the first place.
Yes, and I'll be interested in your book on Obama. So thank you for bringing that to my attention. So you have a quote from Professor Michael Mandelbaum in your book, and this one I think summarizes what the Bush doctrine is. So the quote says, grudgingly, tacitly, silently, other countries support the American role in the world's government out of the well-grounded fear that while the conduct of the United States may be clumsy, overbearing, and occasionally even insufferable, the alternative would be even worse. perhaps much worse. So I guess my question now to you is, what are the alternatives? And could we have a world where certain international governing bodies take the lead rather than just one nation among nations?
Well, there are a variety of critiques along those lines. Let me start with the one you just concluded with, which is the internationalist, multilateral international organization argument that international organizations can substitute for American power and the willingness to use it in conjunction with like-minded strategic allies, preferably open societies, but sometimes you need more than that and should be open to collaborating based on necessity, realizing that there's always a distinction between a more reliable democratic ally and a less reliable non-democratic one. So let's start with the international institution argument first, and then move all the way to the other side to isolationism or some version of what I call unrealistic realism or offshore balancing. Let's start with the first one. I'll start with the Beach Boys. Wouldn't it be nice if international organization could replace the rule of force with the rule of law, where there's a monopoly on the legitimate use of violence akin to a well-ordered domestic society? That was the ideal of Woodrow Wilson. That's been the ideal of many progressives. That was the original hope for the United Nations. And it never works out that way. And it never works out that way for fundamental structural reasons. Let's take the United Nations, that theoretically is the international institution that determines legitimacy on the use of force. As Henry Kissinger points out in his book, Diplomacy, page 25, Touchstone Press, 1994, paperback edition. International organizations would need three things to enforce the rule of law in a way equivalent to a domestic system where the United States government has the monopoly on the legitimate use of violence. A, it needs sufficient intrinsic force in its own right to overcome the most powerful potential aggressor. That has never occurred. The United Nations doesn't have the force in its own right to compel China or the United States, powerful countries, even more middle-ranking countries like Russia. So there's a force deficit. The second thing international organization would need is a universally agreed upon definition of what an aggressor, who an aggressor was, and a uniform agreement in each specific case of who the aggressor is in a given situation. That's never happened either. Look at the dispute between Israel and its neighbors. And then the third thing is that even in the rare circumstances when you have a consensus internationally on who the aggressor is, states are not always willing to run the same risks to deal with aggression. So, for example, look at the genocide in Rwanda, the Janjaweed in Sudan, name it. If you're sitting in Taiwan and you're looking at the menacing behavior of the People's Republic of China, and someone says, well, why don't you go into the United Nations? You're going to tell that person, you need a drug test. The Security Council is structured where there are 5 permanent members and 10 other rotating members. Each of the 5 permanent members have a veto. China is one of those members. Putin's Russia is another one of those members. It defies logic to think that they're going to cooperate in using the United Nations to discipline or respond to aggression against Taiwan in China's case, or Ukraine in Russia's case, that those two countries initiate. So forget the international relations multilateral response. People often go to the UN, countries often go to the UN when they want to look like they're being internationalist, but they want an excuse not to act. That was Obama's the great appeal of the UN to Obama. It constrained American power. And he thought it needed constraining. And go all the other way to the isolationist end, saying, why do we have to be in Ukraine? Let the Indo-Pacific powers balance China if that's necessary. We can go back to the 19th century. Well, technology is different. This is not the age of sail. We can't automatically count on the British maintaining the balance that they could in the 19th century based on a concatenation of circumstances. But in the 20th, Germany was too strong in 1917 and would have won the war if we hadn't intervened. Hitler would have won World War II if we hadn't intervened. The Soviet Union would have won the Cold War. And even today, even though Europe has the capability to stop Putin, they don't have the political will without us. Let's be honest. The reaction of Europe has been stronger than many people expected. But even so, there are many weak links still, particularly the French and the Germans. And let's be honest, too, without the United States, however inept Biden has been, by my calculation, Putin would be on the Polish border. And in the Indo-Pacific, when we have countries that are much more willing to take stern action to counterbalance China, Japan, South Korea, potentially Modi's India, the ANZUS countries, Australia, New Zealand, that's all well and good. But China is too big. It's too powerful. There's no conceivable balancing coalition against China that could effectively counteract China without the active leadership of the United States. If we just said, let's say we do a thought experiment. Suppose the United States disappeared. What would the Indo-Pacific look like the next day? Even stipulating the more clear perception in Asia rather than Europe that China is a threat and an existential one, allies are absolutely necessary for us, but allies alone cannot vindicate the national interest rightly understood, and it's penny wise, pound foolish. Many years ago in a journal, Naval Institute Proceedings, a strategist historian from Claremont University, Tom Cotton, has cited this in his very fine new book, Only the Strong, which makes the case why the United States has to remain the world's default power. If you want to stop aggression, you're better off stopping it when we have a forward deployment than waiting until the aggression metastasizes and your enemies dominate major power centers. Kind of like cancer. Yes, there are unfortunate byproducts. Yes, we've made mistakes in applying these principles of being proactive to a specific situation. But overall, if you did a thought experiment today and said, what would the world look like without the United States taking the lead in maintaining balances in major power centers? If we didn't exist, to quote Thomas Hobbes or to paraphrase him, as a matter of high probability, China would be dominating the Indo-Pacific by virtue of its ambitions, its malevolent regime, and the lack of an effective alternative balancing coalition. Putin would be in a much better strategic position, and the longer you wait with Putin, the greater the cost of the balancing. And the Middle East would be some version of Thomas Hobbes's life being nasty, solitary, and brutish and short. So, to paraphrase Winston Churchill, America being the world's default power, preventing this happening, which is to our benefit as well, it's enlightened self-interest. It's the worst thing ever, except for any of the other alternatives. And I think it's wishful and dangerous thinking. All these things that people say are alternatives, how many times do we have to try them? Remember Putin. The problem with Putin is not that we were stern with him, we misread him. There was the reset under Obama, et cetera, et cetera. How many more times are we going to do this? The wishful thinking about China is the greatest intelligence failure in American history. The idea that China is a traditional great power, according to realists or liberal internationalists like Clinton, who said, if you trade with China, they're going to become democracies. China requires containment across the board, the way the Soviet Union did for many of the same reasons. And the United States has to take the lead in that, because if we don't, China wins. And if you want to say, well, why does that matter? Look at the fate of the Uyghurs. Look at the fate of Hong Kong. That's what Xi Jinping has in mind for Taiwan and many other places, if we are foolish and cowardly enough to let him get away with it.
Right. I'd like to show you that aside from your own book, I've been making my way through this one too, which you've mentioned. So I guess in answering your question, what would the world order look like without the United States? Then I would say historically, there is a world order with the absence of the United States. In fact, the US did not enter into the world stage until 1917, when Wilson intervened in the First World War. And Kissinger mentions his two favorite episodes of international relations being the Treaty of Westphalia, which ended 30 years of warfare between all European powers, and the Congress of Vienna, city which I'm sitting in, where the powers that remain sort of like devise a system wherein each one balance out the power of the other and avoid a hegemonic power like France to rise up again. Both of these two episodes happened without the United States.
Right. Yeah. They did. Here's the problem. This is why, in many ways, I would call Henry Kissinger a romantic realist. And what you just said was the root cause of his failure with détente. He thought he could create a 20th century version of this, a multipolar system, a world of 5 major powers, but instead of the world's power centers being focused in Europe, he globalized it. And the problem is that what made the European balance of power work in the 19th century, it was based on a specific set of conditions, technological and political. A, 5 relatively equal powers, where you could, based on site, based on population and territory, who the 5 major powers were. B, the British being willing to maintain the balance if any single entity aspired to hegemony, and not only being willing, but having the capability in a timely way to tip the balance to restore equilibrium before a power-seeking hegemony achieved it. Well, here's the problem. When we move to the steam engine and the internal combustion engine, combined with the Industrial Revolution, and remember, at the beginning of the 20th century, Germany was the major continental power in Europe, at the cusp of the Industrial Revolution. Germany didn't exist in 1818. Prussia, which was German, but most Germans were not incorporated in Prussia, was the weakest of the five powers. So what Theodore Roosevelt, what Halford Mackinder, before him, the geographical pivot of history, what Nicholas Speakman warned in 1943, the idea of geopolitics, is that in the 20th century, things had changed fundamentally so that the United States could no longer count on the British having the capability to maintain the balance of power when a German or later a Russian state aspired to that type of hegemony. And when World War I began, Theodore Roosevelt, who was an ex-president at that point, warned, this is not going to end like previous wars where the British have the capability to restore the balance. If we don't act as a major power, the Germans win, and that's to our detriment. People didn't believe him. 1917. And then after World War I, for a variety of reasons, including Woodrow Wilson's overreach, many Americans concluded, well, our intervention in World War I was a mistake. Let's go back to our original paradigm that worked so well in the 19th century. Well, we did that, and it was a disaster applied to Hitler in a different set of circumstances. And what Pearl Harbor did is jolt the American people in our leadership, at least for a generation, to conclude what we were doing in the 19th century was perfectly appropriate for the conditions of the 19th century, but positively reckless for the 20th century. And by the way, that was one of the underlying premises of the Bush Doctrine. Many people argued, for example, well, containment of the Soviet Union worked. We didn't have to wage war except by proxy. Why didn't we just contain Iran or Iraq? And the answer is people like Saddam have a different risk calculus. The Soviet Union's calculation of risk, even if you assume, as I do, that Reagan was right, they sought world domination. Difference between Stalin and Hitler is you could deter Stalin and you couldn't do that with Hitler because Hitler was a man in a hurry. So while I commend Kissinger's historical defense of the 19th century Congress of Vienna, I would quarrel with him then and now about whether that was an appropriate or misleading analogy for the circumstances we face in the 20th century. And if you look, for example, let's take Europe without the United States. Let's grade their, give them a final exam on several major challenges. How did Europe do in terms of dealing with Kaiser Wilhelm's Germany? Well, they would have lost had the United States not intervened. How did Europe do with Hitler? They would have lost. How did Europe do, or would Europe have done had the United States in a bipolar era where there weren't five major powers but two dominant ones? How would the United States, how would Europe have done against the Soviet Union without us? They would have lost. How was Germany doing with Putin, trying to appease him when Putin invades Crimea and then Ukraine proper? How has Europe without us done with radical Islam? And even in the Indo-Pacific, where the strategic insight of the major leaders, particularly in Japan, are much keener than the French or the Germans still in Europe, the Japanese would be terrified, rightly, if the United States withdrew from the Indo-Pacific because they know that there's no conceivable balancing coalition that can effectively stop Xi Jinping without the active participation and robust capability of the United States added to it. Just no way around that. And I think we've been deluding ourselves that China's heading in our direction, which it's not. Look, I can understand why people were optimistic about China in the 80s because compared to Mao, Deng Xiaoping's four modernizations looked far more progressive. Tiananmen Square should have disabused us of the notion that China was going to evolve in our direction. The party values its dominance more than it does prosperity. That's been true even under Deng Xiaoping, and it's particularly true under Xi Jinping. His number one goal was to maintain the primacy of his party, and he sees us as the prime obstacle to that. He wants a world safe for Chinese tyranny, and if we don't wake up, he's going to get his wish.
So I would like to focus on a different country in the Middle Eastern region that's not Iraq or Iran, that being Israel. There's a current of, I guess, thought in the I guess Kissinger's successor camp, aka the neo-realists, that they find that America's solid allyship with the Jewish state is contrary to the United States' national interests. Obviously, you have that notorious book, right? The Israel Lobby and U.S. Foreign Policy by Mearsheimer and Walt.
Yep, I've been in journal debates with these guys and happy to comment on that. And I will just give you a preview. I disagree with them across the board, but go ahead. Inform your listeners what their thesis is.
Okay. I guess from my understanding, the two of them believe that there are one or several Jewish groups headquartered in Washington, and they influence U.S. foreign policy, I guess, from behind the curtain. And so that is why the United States, no matter which party gains power, still funds Israel militarily and otherwise, and that the efforts to make peace with the Palestinians never came to fruition, and that is why all of the other countries in the Middle Eastern region dislikes America, because America sort of allows a Jewish state in the middle of Arab lands. So I guess that's my understanding. But I would like to ask you, of course, what are your disagreements on that? And secondly, what does Israel play in the Bush doctrine?
Okay, let me start with telling you what's wrong with Steve Walt and John Mearsheimer's view of the world that applies not only to the Middle East, but their view of the United States. They are what's called neo-realists. And the difference between neo-realists and classical realists like Kissinger is that the latter take into account a broader range of variables in assessing friends, foes, threats, and opportunities. Not broad enough in Kissinger's case, for my mind, but the neo-realists are much more stringent in what they think matters for how states behave. So for neo-realists, although Mearsheimer and Steve Walt contradict themselves, I'll explain how when they criticize Israel. For neo-realists, the nature of the leader character of the regime don't matter. All states behave alike. Or to put it, doesn't matter what China is, a democracy, a dictatorship, a monarchy, communist regime. States behave based on the external incentives of the international system, the distribution of power, and there's no moral or geopolitical difference between the United States and China. And there's no such idea of a democratic peace, and there's no such idea of evil, good, or regimes falling somewhere in between. Regimes all behave alike. Now, if that's the case, how do they explain the United States' affinity for Israel? Well, then you scratch the surface, and what you really learn is they wish all regimes behaved alike. And when they don't, then they have some explanation akin to a conspiracy theory. This is old-fashioned anti-Semitism protocols of the elders of Zion. First of all, their assumption all regimes are the same. It's nonsense. We dealt with many Germanys. Would anybody say that Germany today is the same type of danger as Germany under Hitler? Of course not. For all America's problems, are we morally equivalent to Xi Jinping, Hitler, Stalin, Mao? Of course not. So they're wrong about that. And they're wrong about the idea that all leaders calculate risk in the same way. One of the things Winston Churchill, who was, I think, the greatest statesman in history, observed is, yeah, the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany were evil empires, same reason. But you could deter Stalin and not deter Hitler because even within their shared framework and the shared dimension of the threat, Stalin had a different calculation of risk that made him deterrable in a way that Hitler was not. So the Mearsheimer's idea and Walt's idea about this Jewish lobby, one, let's take the Iraq War. There were 6 people of Jewish background in the Senate. 5 voted against the war. Did you know that the strongest constituency for Israel in the United States isn't the Jewish community at all, even if you think it's illegitimate? I don't. Walter Russell Mead wrote a wonderful new book that demolished this idea. The strongest voice for Israel in the United States is the Christian right. So how do we get to a Jewish lobby led by Christians? In other words, what they're doing is they are trying to delegitimize the motives and to cast doubt on the loyalty of people. Look, they're entitled to disagree. I don't agree with them, but they're entitled. An honorable person can say, hey, look, I don't see Israel as being the strategic asset you do. And I think for our interest, our support should be more qualified. I don't agree with that, but that's a reasonable, rational argument. What's illegitimate is to say, oh, you're either stupid if you support Israel, or even worse, you're part of a lobby. And this is sort of, you asked me before about this Cheney, Wolfowitz, Pearl imagination conspiracy. This is sort of an academic version with some theoretically dubious underpinnings of many anti-Semitic arguments. Charles Lindbergh, 30s, the Jews are manipulating us to get us into World War II. This argument is ugly, anti-empirical. It's wrong philosophically in terms of the way they narrowly look at critical variables in international relations, and it's sort of the German academic Martin Heidegger in the 30s tried to make an intellectual case for Hitler. someone put it very, very well. What's old in this book by Mearsheimer and Walt, it's ugly and it's not very good. What's new is wrong and unoriginal. So just on all quarters, I think it's wrong. And Walter Russell Mead, in his new book, really demolishes this thesis, one of our greatest public intellectuals on foreign policy. And worse than that, it's ugly. You may not, I know Paul Wolfowitz, I know Richard Pearl, I know these people. They're patriots. You may disagree with them. The same way you may disagree with someone who says Taiwan's in our interest, who is of ancestry or has relatives. That doesn't, that's no way to argue with anybody on anything, reactively to devaluate people and assume the worst motives. Sometimes people have bad motives, but debate the issue on the merit rather than to cast it in the form of a conspiracy theory, which is really a way not to have an argument and to demonize, denigrate, and dehumanize rather than a serious argument. Shame on Walt, shame on Mearsheimer, who with their credentials ought to know better, but they don't.
Mm-hmm. Well, you characterize the Bush doctrine as moral democratic realism.
Yes.
From my understanding, it rests on two central, I guess, assumptions. One is that it is better to be allied with regimes and countries that share your values. In the case of the United States, liberal and democratic, which is why NATO still exists.
And it's why also the alliance with Japan is our most important alliance, and the ANZUS Pact. And that's why I'm also think that the Quad is a very, very important framework that incorporates democratic India to the extent we can into that coalition value base. That said, I'm a realist because as Natan Sharansky said, it's great to have democratic allies as your foundational alliances when you can get them. Sometimes that's not the case. For example, in World War II, the paradox is that had we listened to Churchill, we could have stopped Hitler without the Soviet Union. Mm-hmm. But by the time Hitler invaded the Soviet Union after the consequences of appeasement, the defeat of France, Winston Churchill, who had warned about appeasement, who considered the Soviet Union an evil empire, the day that Hitler invaded Soviet Union, Churchill made several speeches in the House of Commons commenting favorably on the Soviet Union. That astonished a journalist who knew Churchill's longtime antipathy to communism, to the Soviet Union in particular. Even in the 1920s, Churchill advocated a preemptive war to stop the Bolshevik Revolution. He called Vladimir Ilyich Lenin an insect bacillus. So the reporter listening to this, a commie to Stalin, asked Churchill, what's going on? And Churchill's response is, circumstance, sir. In the predicament I'm in, I would have made a favorable reference to the devil in the House of Commons had Hitler invaded hell on this day. Meaning, sometimes, to quote Mick Jagger and the Rolling Stones, you like to have a democratic ally, but you can't always get what you want. And you may come to the conclusion that your non-democratic collaborators are not as reliable in the long term. But in the Middle East, for example, where there's been one democracy period, we've needed to collaborate with caution with the Saudis. with the Shah of Iran. In the case of the Indo-Pacific, the core of my conception of a strategic alliance system is a value-based democratic one. But for regimes that are not democratic, that fear China and understand China's behavior, Vietnam, for instance, if Vietnam wants to partner with us on the issue of containing China and offer us our facilities, their facilities at Cam Ranh Bay, I'm going to take it because being a moral purist in a situation, you need an ethic of the lesser evil. That yes, you want democratic allies, they're better allies. There's a lot of evidence to support the democratic piece, but you can't always get what you want. Let me give you another classic example where during the Arab Spring, when it spread to Egypt, and the Obama administration naively thought that if you got rid of Mubarak, who was an authoritarian, I don't think you could have saved Mubarak, but the Obama thought, oh, the Muslim Brotherhood, that's great. Carter, the Ayatollah, that's great. The will of the people. And that's not necessarily so. And for all the problems of the Egyptian military right now, that's a less bad alternative for us morally and strategically, given the lack of any other plausible option other than an Islamist hostile regime. You have to know that you can't always get what you want to know what you want. And in general, Sharansky's right. You prefer a democracy as an ally to a dictatorship, even a dictatorship that likes you. That's not always on the table. So you have to employ something like Jeane Kirkpatrick's analysis, who is also pro-democracy, dictatorships and double standards. In cases where there aren't plausible, reliable democratic allies, you're better off with an authoritarian regime that's not anti-American in terms of its capacity to evolve more benignly than a left-wing regime that's more anti-American, and communism is unreformable. It has to collapse. So realism means that you have to take into account human nature. For example, I'm a realist because anybody who says that the United States, or there's a component of realism, should rely on the United Nations as a substitute for American power, that's aspirational, but not realistic given the structure of the world and human nature. I am not a strict realist, which I have moral involved in it, because I don't think that ethics don't apply to international relations. I think that international relations operates in an ethical realm where the use of force is going to be more necessary than domestic politics, because internationally it's the equivalent of what gives rise to self-defense when there is no authority present and you have a conditional right to defend yourself. That rare circumstances in domestic politics is the way the world is right now in international politics, which doesn't change the ethics, but it changes the dynamics.
Mm-hmm. Right. So that brings me to the second assumption, which I drew from the book, which is moral democratic realism assumes that those regimes who are anti-American and authoritarian, often if you are anti-American, you are inevitably authoritarian, maybe except in the case of France. It is unwise to seek agreements or deals with them in the hopes that they will, I guess, convert to the pro-American side, because you've mentioned in the beginning of our talk, these anti-American regimes dislikes the United States not for what it does or did in the past, but for what it represents. So an example of this folly is Obama's deal with the Iranian authorities regarding nuclear fusion and development and such. The Bush doctrine would categorically reject this. So, how so?
Well, I'm going to, you laid out, I think, some of my general points, but I'm going to make a few distinctions. Authoritarian regimes come in a variety of flavors, and the best way to look at it is on a spectrum. The more repressive the regime, and the more it's animated by an anti-American ideology to the point of communism, the greater the burden of proof that you want to make an agreement with a rogue regime, as Michael Rubin put it. But let me give you some positive examples of how the United States, A, relied on authoritarian regimes rather than totalitarian ones, and B, our engagement actually ended up promoting democracy. Mm-hmm. 2 places in the Indo-Pacific. I could give you 3, but I'm going to focus on 2. Was Chiang Kai-shek, who fled to the island of Taiwan, a Democrat? Mm-hmm. No, but he wasn't a tyrant like Mao. And Taiwan was not only under the nationalist pro-American, but Chiang Kai-shek's traditional authoritarianism and the gravitational pull of its alignment with the United States eventually created the space for an open society. Do you see any of that on the Chinese mainland? Let's go to the Korean Peninsula. Stark example. People don't realize. They look at Korea now and say, well, look, they're a modern industrial democracy. Wow. It didn't start that way. The per capita income in Korea, South Korea in 1950, was lower than any of the sub-Saharan African colonies. And Syngman Rhee was not a Democrat, he was an autocrat, the leader of South Korea. And yet, engagement with the United States and the fact that Rhee was a traditional dictator rather than an ideological one allowed over time for a gravitational pull to open the space up for Korea linked to the United States, South Korea, to be an open society. Have you seen any of that in North Korea? No, and this is Gene Kirkpatrick's distinction. Egypt right now is not an open society, but is less repressive than a Sunni version of the Iranian regime. And it has a greater, though not assured capacity, not only to be less anti-American, but to evolve in a more benign direction. Communism has never, ever, ever been able to reform itself. It's unreformable because it's totalistic. As Ronald Reagan understood, it has to collapse. Now, there are certain extraordinary circumstances when you're faced with Hitler and Stalin, and the choice in 1941 for Churchill is, do I win a partial but significant victory with Stalin, or do I lose with Hitler? You choose the lesser evil. Now, several lessons emanate from that. One, you try not to create those circumstances where you have to rely on devils in the first place. But 2, statesmen have to deal with the hand that's given them. And so 3, one needs an ethic of the lesser evil in international relations where the idea of utopian outcomes does not exist. John Kennedy put it pretty well when it came to this dilemma, contemplating whether to intervene during a rebellion in the Dominican Republic. Kenny said, my preference is a stable democratic ally if I can get it as my first choice, but I will take an authoritarian ally if I can't get one, and three, a hostile, more repressive anti-American regime seems the most likely outcome if I don't support option two. So these are presumptions that have to be applied to circumstance. Now, sometimes circumstances are better than your ally, who is always going to say, let's take Marcos in the Philippines. When there was dissension on the streets, Marcos says, hey, if you get rid of me, you're going to get the communists. Sometimes, but Reagan decided, with some advice from his close friend Paul Laxalt, senator from Nevada, is that really so, or is there a viable democratic alternative? And it turns out there was, Aquino. In other words, my approach doesn't give you the answer. It gives you the questions to consider. Is there a reliable, open, democratic ally that's a plausible alternative? That's a question. If there isn't, what's the lesser evil? That's a question. And what's the probability of A, B, and C? The best outcome, the lesser evil, or the worst outcome? And that would be my framework derived from Gene Kirkpatrick for my determination of alignments. Notice, this is anti-Walt, this is anti-Mearsheimer. Those two don't even take into account the nature of the regimes or the belief system of leaders, except when it comes to Israel, which again raises the issue, why is there a double standard when it comes to Israel that they don't apply to anybody else? There's a historic answer to that, which is pretty ugly, that Walter Russell Mead writes about if you're interested in pursuing that.
Yes, I'm aware of his new book, The Ark of a Covenant.
Yeah, wonderful book.
So, final question. How would the Bush Doctrine can be applied in the case of the Russia-Ukraine war?
Well, it would certainly say that we have a vital interest morally and geopolitically within the bounds of measured risk to have Ukraine prevail. It would also say that although China is the major threat, Russia and China are now immersed in a mutual security pact where both of them are our enemies, and weakness in Ukraine will also embolden China and Taiwan, in Taiwan and elsewhere. I am not for putting American boots on the ground in Ukraine. I am for giving Ukraine, like Lend-Lease in 1941, all the weapons they need to defend themselves. And I think any outcome of this war that eventually doesn't lead to Ukraine being incorporated into NATO will just be an armed truce that will tempt Putin to do it again. So I'm not calling for preemptive war against Russia, nor did Bush. Bush, in terms of when you use force sooner, emphasized an interplay of variables, the calculation of risk of the leaders. Putin is diabolical. In many ways, he's used as ethnic diaspora, including Ukraine, playing a weak hand strongly the way Hitler did in the 1930s. But the odds are that robust deterrence can work with Putin in a way that wouldn't work with a Hitler. Robust deterrence, in my calculation, would work with Xi Jinping, despite his ambitions, given his risk calculus. I do think, however, and I just talked to Bush 43, we agree on this point, and many others, that if we do not stand firm on Ukraine, don't think the ramifications are just going to be about Ukraine. Let me give you the most recent example. Biden thought unwisely ahistorically that the pullout of Afghanistan, that won't affect anything other than Afghanistan. Bad enough as that was. Well, you have to have your head in the sand not to realize that the moment we pulled out of Afghanistan, China intensified its provocative behavior, flying hundreds of sorties into Taiwanese airspace, broadcasting to the Taiwanese to demoralize them. America won't come to defend you. And Putin, almost from the moment of our pullout, planned to the invasion of Ukraine proper, just the way Putin planned his invasion of Crimea from the moment Obama caved in on his Syrian red line. In international relations, particularly in the world we're in of instant communication, there's going to be a domino effect. What you do in one region is immediately going to affect the calculation of a statesman's or a dictator's risk in other areas. So getting back to my original point of the Bush Doctrine that I still think applies, you can run, but you can't hide. And if you try to hide, you're only going to have to draw the line down the road in a more difficult situation. Better to stop Putin in Ukraine and stop China from dominating Taiwan in the first place than have to deal with the terrible consequence of Ukraine being incorporated in the Russian Empire, or even worse, Taiwan being incorporated into Chinese tyranny, which would literally destroy the first island chain's line of defense and make Japan extremely difficult, credibly, to defend, which would be an invitation to terrible danger.
Well, on that note, thank you very much, Professor Robert Kaufman of Pepperdine University, for being on this program.
Well, thanks for having me again. I really enjoyed it. And I thank you for being such an informed and thoughtful host. I appreciate doing it.
I tried to do my homework.
You did.
Take care of yourself.
I wish my students did their homework the way you do. Thank you very much.
Oh, much appreciated. Thank you.
Bye-bye.